For this presentation, I will be conceptualizing Nicole's experiences using a trauma-informed component-based framework, primarily drawing from treating adult survivors of childhood emotional abuse and neglect. This approach focuses on how trauma impacts multiple domains of functioning rather than viewing difficulties in isolation. It aligns with broader trauma literature, which emphasizes that trauma is shaped by how experiences are internalized and carried over time. Nicole's case reflects the complexity of chronic emotional abuse and neglect, particularly how these experiences influence relationships, emotional regulation, identity, and meaning making. What stands out is how interconnected these patterns are. Rather than separate concerns, they can be understood as part of a larger system shaped by her early environment. This framework guides how I approach her case, focusing on understanding patterns in context and working across the domains of relationship, regulation, dissociation, and narrative. If I worked with Nicole, I would introduce myself as a trauma-informed relational counselor focused on safety, attunement, and trust. Instead of trying to change her behavior, I would approach her with curiosity and a genuine desire to understand how her experiences influence her interactions. My work would be guided by several theoretical frameworks. Attachment theory helps me understand how early relationships shape Nicole's current relational patterns. Component-based psychotherapy offers a structured framework for conceptualizing trauma. And family systems theory helps me understand Nicole within the context of her family, including the effects of her mother's control and her father's passivity. Parts work helps me recognize the distinct self states that may emerge in response to trauma. Together, these frameworks guide me in creating a therapeutic space where Nicole can begin to feel safe, understood, and less defined by her survival strategies. In Nicole's case, trauma is best understood as something that has shaped how she experiences herself and others over time, rather than a single event or isolated experience. What stands out in the component-based model is how trauma affects multiple domains at once. Figure 1.1 illustrates this by showing the interaction between relationship, regulation, dissociation, and narrative. These areas do not function independently. They influence one another continuously. For example, disruptions in early relationships can impact how someone regulates emotion, which in turn can influence how they make meaning of their experiences or how connected they feel to themselves. This aligns with trauma literature that emphasizes how overwhelming or unsupported experiences can affect not just emotional responses, but also awareness, identity, and relational functioning. As a counselor in training, this framework shifts my focus from identifying isolated symptoms to understanding patterns across systems. It requires me to approach the work with patience and to recognize that changes in one area may influence others over time. The relationship domain focuses on how individuals experience connection, particularly whether it feels safe, predictable, and mutually responsive, or uncertain and difficult to navigate. These patterns are formed through early caregiving experiences where individuals begin to develop expectations about trust, closeness, and their role within relationships. When those early interactions are inconsistent or emotionally harmful, individuals may come to approach relationships with caution or heightened sensitivity to how others respond. As outlined in Treating Adult Survivors, these early dynamics influence not only how connection is experienced, but also how individuals understand themselves within relationships. This domain helps frame connection as something that is learned and carried forward rather than something that develops automatically. Looking at Nicole through figure 3.1, her relational functioning appears to reflect difficulty maintaining a consistent sense of safety and self within connection. Rather than relationships providing stability, her experience of trust and closeness seems to fluctuate depending on the immediate relational context. Her early experiences help explain this pattern. Exposure to control and emotional harm, alongside limited protection, may have contributed to an internal working model in which connection is both sought and experienced as uncertain. This is consistent with patterns associated with disorganized attachment, where proximity does not reliably lead to regulation or security. Within this framework, her attention to how she is perceived by others can be understood as a way of orienting herself in relationships. Instead of relying on an internal sense of security, she appears to use relational feedback to determine how to respond and who she is within the interaction. From a clinical perspective, this suggests that the therapeutic relationship would need to emphasize consistency and predictability, allowing for the gradual development of trust that is less dependent on moment to moment external cues. When I reflect on figure 3.1, I recognize that I have a strong desire for connection and to feel seen and heard within relationships. I'm naturally drawn to emotional depth and intellectual engagement, and I value relationships that feel mutual and meaningful. I can see patterns where I may take on more emotional responsibility within relationships. I may feel a pull toward individuals who are more emotionally detached or less engaged, which can create an imbalance over time. In those dynamics, I can find myself trying to bridge the gap or carry more of the emotional weight in the relationship. This also helps me understand how at times I may be more vulnerable to enmeshed dynamics, especially when connection feels uncertain or inconsistent. From a developmental perspective, this makes sense as an adaptive way of maintaining connection, even when it requires overextending myself. I'm continuing to grow in my awareness of boundaries and differentiation, learning to stay connected while also maintaining a clear sense of self. This awareness is important in clinical work as it allows me to bring empathy and depth while also remaining grounded and appropriately boundaried. When I consider working with Nicole, I can identify meaningful areas of alignment and potential challenges. In terms of strength, we both appear to value connection and emotional depth. This shared orientation may foster a strong therapeutic alliance. My capacity for attunement and sensitivity to emotional experience may help Nicole feel seen and understood in ways that perhaps were limited in her earlier relationships. There are important areas to remain mindful of, given my tendency toward over responsibility in relationships. I may feel a pull to take on more emotional weight in the therapeutic process. This could lead to over identification, especially if Nicole presents with unmet relational needs that resonate with my own patterns. There is also a potential challenge in maintaining clear boundaries when relational dynamics become imbalanced. It will be important for me to remain grounded, recognizing that what belongs to Nicole and what belongs to me are different while continuing to provide consistent support. Overall, this awareness helps me approach the work with intention, using both my strengths and areas for growth to support a safe, balanced, and effective therapeutic relationship. The regulation domain focuses on how individuals organize and remain engaged with their emotional experience, particularly during periods of increased intensity. This domain is less about the presence of emotion and more about the consistency of connection to that emotion over time. Some individuals are able to stay connected to what they feel even when emotions are strong, and while others may experience shifts in their ability to remain engaged. From a clinical perspective, regulation involves the capacity to sustain awareness and organization without becoming overwhelmed or needing to disengage. This includes how emotions are recognized, tolerated, and integrated within ongoing experience. As described in Treating Adult Survivors, regulation can vary in stability depending on early relational experiences, particularly whether emotional responses were supported and made sense of. This domain helps frame emotional experience as something that can be more or less organized rather than simply controlled or reduced. Building from the regulation framework, Nicole's pattern appears to reflect variability in how consistently she can remain connected to her emotional experience, particularly under stress. When emotional intensity increases, her ability to stay organized may shift, leading to changes in how she responds or disengages. This suggests that her regulation is not absent, but less consistent across situations. Her case material indicates that emotional experiences were not reliable or reliably supported or integrated within her early environment. As a result, her regulatory system appears to rely more on external reference points, such as how she is perceived or evaluated, rather than a stable internal process. This helps contextualize her use of validation, comparison, and appearance. These strategies may function to create temporary organization in moments where her internal state feels less stable or more uncertain. Overall, Nicole appears to fall toward the more vulnerable end of regulatory consistency within this domain, particularly in contexts involving relational stress or evaluation. Clinically, this suggests a focus on strengthening her ability to remain connected to her internal experience across varying levels of intensity, rather than relying primarily on external cues for stability. Reflecting on my patterns in figure 5.1, I notice a strong sensitivity to emotional experiences, both in myself and others. Rather than diminishing it, I'm learning to recognize, accept, and live in harmony with it. From a parts perspective, I see this sensitivity as a part of me that is deeply connected to emotional environments. It likely evolved to help me stay connected, aware, and responsive in relationships. Its strengths include empathy, depth, and resilience in navigating complex emotions. However, this part can become highly active, especially in emotionally intense or prolonged situations. When that happens, I may feel burdened by more emotional weight than is mine, making it difficult to stay grounded and separate. This approach helps me stay connected to my sensitivity while maintaining balance. In practice, I can remain present with clients without becoming overwhelmed or overly identified with their feelings. Ultimately, the aim is not to change who I am, but to develop internal harmony in which my sensitivity is a strength, supported by my awareness, balance, and deliberate regulation. My growth involves learning to stay present with emotional intensity without internalizing it. This includes understanding my limits and creating space rather than taking responsibility for everything I experience. In thinking about how this would play out in the room with Nicole, I can see both areas of alignment and areas that need care. My ability to remain present with emotional intensity may be supportive for Nicole, particularly in moments where her experience feels less stable. Being able to stay grounded could help provide a sense of continuity when her internal experience begins to shift. I need to be mindful of my tendency to move toward emotional depth. In moments where Nicole is highly activated, there may be a pull for me to engage in a way that increases intensity rather than stabilizing it. This means my role is not just to be present, but to be intentional about pacing. Supporting regulation in this context involves maintaining a steady presence while allowing space for her experience to organize rather than becoming part of the emotional fluctuation. The work would require balancing attunement with grounding, remaining connected while also helping to create stability within the interaction. Dissociation can be understood as a change in how connected someone feels to their experience in a given moment. Rather than being all or nothing, dissociation exists along a continuum. It can range from subtle forms of disconnection, such as feeling distant or detached, to more noticeable shifts in awareness. Within the component-based framework described in Treating Adult Survivors, dissociation reflects how the system manages experiences that are difficult to stay fully connected to. This domain differs from regulation in an important way. While regulation involves maintaining connection to emotional experience, dissociation reflects a movement away from that connection when it becomes difficult to sustain. Understanding dissociation in this way allows me to recognize these shifts not as absence, but as meaningful changes in awareness that can be gently supported toward reconnection. Given Nicole's experience in Figure 7.1, I want to approach this domain with care and avoid making assumptions beyond what she has shared. It seems possible that Nicole may experience forms of dissociation that are more subtle and exist along the spectrum. For example, she may experience moments when emotional experiences feel overwhelming, and in response, she may shift toward disconnection or numbing. In the 4D model, this could manifest in different ways. In the time dimension, there may be moments where past emotional experiences feel present in current situations. In thought, this may appear as internalized, self-critical dialogue shaped by earlier relational experiences. In the body, there may be some level of disconnection or reduced awareness, particularly during stress. Emotionally, she may oscillate between intensity and detachment. These responses can be understood as protective in environments where emotional experiences were overwhelming. According to treating adult survivors, dissociation is not inherently pathological, but reflects the system's attempt to manage experiences that were difficult to fully process. It feels important to approach this with curiosity and respect, recognizing that any dissociative responses may have served a meaningful role in helping Nicole navigate her environment. In my own experience, dissociation tends to show up as a shift in attention rather than a full sense of disconnection. I may notice that my focus narrows or becomes less flexible, especially in situations that feel overwhelming or required sustained emotional engagement. Instead of feeling fully present, my awareness can become more internally focused or less responsive to what is happening around me. This pattern is usually subtle, but it can impact how consistently I stay engaged in the moment. What has become important for me is recognizing these shifts as they happen, rather than after the fact. That awareness allows me to reorient and remain more fully present, particularly in relational settings. In clinical work, this matters because maintaining consistent attention and awareness is part of how I support connection. Being able to notice when my attention shifts helps me stay engaged and responsive within the therapeutic space. In working with Nicole, dissociation would likely show up through subtle changes in how connected the interaction feels. Nicole may experience moments where her level of engagement shifts, particularly when emotional intensity increases. These shifts may not always be obvious, but could appear as changes in attention, responsiveness, or presence. My awareness of my own patterns helps here. Because I'm attuned to shifts in attention, I may be able to notice when the interaction begins to feel less connected or when something changes in the moment. At the same time, I need to remain mindful of staying fully engaged myself. If both of us begin to lose connection to the moment, that could impact the consistency of the therapeutic space. This means my role is to maintain steady attention and gently support reconnection when needed, without drawing too much focus to the shift itself. Narrative is the way we come to understand who we are through the stories we hold about our experiences. These stories don't develop in isolation, they are shaped over time through relationships, environments, and also the messages we receive about ourselves. When those experiences include criticism, inconsistency, or emotional harm, the narrative can begin to reflect those conditions. Identity may feel less internally grounded and more influenced by how someone has been seen, responded to, or defined by others. What stands out to me is that these narratives often make sense in context. They're not random or inaccurate, but are shaped by real experiences. Because of that, the goal in this work is not to replace someone's story, but to create space for it to be explored more fully. So it can become more flexible, more coherent, and less tied to shame. In Nicole's case, what stands out is not just how she understands herself, but how consistently her experience links together across time. There are indications that her experience may not always integrate into a continuous narrative. Instead, different emotional or relational states may hold their own meaning without fully connecting to one another. This can make it difficult to carry a stable sense of self from one moment to the next. From a clinical perspective, this suggests that the issue is less about what she believes and more about how experience is integrated. When experiences are not consistently linked, identity can feel fragmented, not in a dramatic sense, but in a way that lacks continuity. In contrast, my experience tends to move in the opposite direction. I naturally link and organize experiences quickly, often creating meaning before the experience has fully unfolded. That difference in experience is important. Um, while Nicole may need support in building connections across experience, I need to be mindful of not creating those connections for her. The clinical work then becomes less about interpretation and more about supporting integration, allowing these experiences to connect over time in a way that feels internally coherent rather than me externally imposing them. When I sit with what narrative work might look like with Nicole, it feels different from the other domains. It asks for a slower, more intentional kind of presence, one that is less focused on understanding quickly and more focused on allowing meaning to emerge. It also feels important to remain aware of the broader context of her experience, including cultural and relational influences, and not assume my perspective is the same as hers. What may support the work is my comfort with reflection and depth. I don't feel the need to rush to conclusions, which can create space for Nicole to explore her story in a way that feels more her own. At the same time, I want to be mindful of how easily I can move toward making meaning, especially through a relational lens. There may be moments where I feel a pull to connect the pieces or understand her story alongside her. While that can come from a place of care, it could also unintentionally shape the process. Because of that, this work requires restraint. It asks me to stay alongside her experience without directing it and to trust that her understanding will unfold in its own time. For me, narrative work becomes less about helping her figure it out and more about creating a space where her story can shift and expand naturally. The goal is for her to experience her identity as her own rather than as something defined by past roles or expectations. Working with Nicole feels like it would stretch me in ways that are both challenging and necessary for my growth. It would ask me to stay connected while also staying grounded in myself, especially in moments where I feel resonance with her experience. This work also calls me to approach others with humility, compassion, and respect for their dignity, which aligns with my faith and the responsibility to care for others ethically. I can see how my natural um, gravitation toward depth and understanding could show up strongly in this work. There is a part of me that wants to make meaning and help things feel clearer, but working with Nicole would require me to slow that down, to allow her to process and unfold in her own time without stepping in too quickly. And that feels like an important area of growth, especially in learning to tolerate uncertainty. This work would also challenge me in how I relate to responsibility. I may feel called to hold emotional weight or to move toward helping in a way that feels familiar. But a growth for me would be recognizing when to step back and create space instead. Learning that I don't have to carry what isn't mine while still remaining present feels like an ongoing process. Over the course of this class, I've learned that I naturally move toward emotional depth, reflection, and meaning. I've also become more aware of how my own experiences, the roles I've taken on, and the messages I've internalized influence how I show up with others. That awareness feels essential because it allows me to be more intentional rather than reactive. What I've learned about clinical work is that it's much less about having answers and much more about how you hold space. It requires patience, restraint, and the ability to sit with complexity without needing to resolve it right away. It also requires a level of self-awareness that doesn't stop because how I show up is part of the work itself. I think what stays with me most is that growth in this field is not just about developing skills, but about continuing to understand myself more honestly. And that feels like something that will continue long after this course. I've provided a slide with my references included. I wanted to take a moment to thank you for watching my presentation and facilitating this opportunity for growth, and I'm looking forward to the bright future ahead and all the learning that's to come. Thank you.